Thank you, Jill, and thanks everybody for attending today. I hope you find the information helpful. And it's something I really believe in. If you attend any of the webinars that we run here at DP Solutions, they're usually very strongly security focused and management focused. And so it's sort of like we talk about half things half the time. So half the time I'm talking about technical tools you need, and the other times I'm talking about people and management stuff. And this is one of those sort of people and management things. So let's get into it. Anyway, just a brief introduction. IT policies are in the big scheme of things not very expensive and very effective way to avoid costly IT challenges, specifically things like data losses, breaches, accidents, etc. Some of these things, security tools are very powerful for addressing actual vulnerabilities, but defense is perfect and it's focusing on addressing specific areas of security, right? So, when Microsoft releases a patch for Windows, that patch is addressing a specific vulnerability. But if the security attack or some kind of incident is going around a patch, it's not focusing on a specific technical defense, your tool isn't necessarily going to help you. What's also to stop an employee from stealing data or doing something improper with it if they have the rights. So I'm actually, we're going to be talking a little bit next month about employee onboarding, spoiler alert. But one thing that we need to understand is that when we bring our people into our organization and we give them access to our files, they get a PC, maybe they get a mobile phone, email accounts, access to our databases, whatever, we're really giving them a lot of trust. And once they have that trust, there's a lot of things they can do with it that could be damaging. Whether it's intentional or not. And so the processes can really step in here and help. The policies help govern what people do with the rights they're given. So once somebody's in, once they have the keys to the car, it's like giving your kid who just got a driver's license the key to the car. You just kind of have to hope they do the right thing. And even though they have a seatbelt, even though they're using the headlights on the car, or maybe there's an airbag or something like that, we can't count on those security tools necessarily to be perfect for us. So anyway, we have an agenda today of talking about the people risks associated with technology. I sort of alluded to this a little bit already. Identifying data stakeholders that will influence your policies. It's really important that as an organization, we understand who is impacted by our security incidents or other technology incidents, because those stakeholders are going to impact how we make decisions and what we end up implementing. Starting policies that almost every organization should use. So, if we were to create a volume of all the potential policies we could create, it's probably massive, certainly beyond the scope of this webinar and not necessary for everybody. But I thought it would be important for us to talk about specific policies that I think just about everybody should have in place. There's also some other more sophisticated policies that you may need. So this is sort of where we get into a little more marginal stuff, things that are maybe for bigger organizations or people with specific data privacy needs, or maybe have compliance concerns, so on and so forth. We're going to talk about communication, acknowledgement, and culture of policy management. So, it's one thing if you write a policy, it's another thing to actually manage, enforce it, update it, so on and so forth. And then resources available to you. This can be very daunting. Creating policies for the first time, especially if you're like most people who are in management or leadership at a small business or a nonprofit or some other organization, you probably have an expertise in the work you do, right? Maybe you're an accountant, or maybe you do fundraising, or maybe you're a salesperson, or who knows what you do. But you probably haven't written an IT policy before. You probably haven't enforced this stuff. So this can be kind of intimidating. And then, of course, Q&A. We are very much looking to engage with you guys. I want to make sure I leave some time at the end just to talk about what your concerns are. So anyway, let's start with people risks. As I said, it's giving the keys to the car to someone just getting their license. You're trusting them with something that could be very dangerous. If you think about this, from a management perspective, when you're hiring a person for the first time, oftentimes you're doing other kinds of checks on that have nothing to do with IT, criminal checks, maybe drug screenings, things like that. So there are risks with people. It seems like sometimes we don't necessarily acknowledge the technical or the IT risks or the security risks. So there's things like accidents, so security and normal mistakes. People are going to make mistakes. People are going to have problems. Maybe they click on the wrong thing and they fall for a cyber attack. Maybe they respond to a phishing email in the way that we don't want, or maybe they share information in a way that's inappropriate. They are supposed to send an encrypted email, and instead they send a regular email. Policy and management speaks to addressing these accidents, either for making sure they don't happen in the first place, but also inevitably when these things do happen, having a process to address them. We also have to be concerned with insider threats. So someone may actively want to steal or share information. So, obviously I don't want to create a culture in an organization where people don't trust one another. But we also have to be cognizant that there are risks that maybe that somebody in our organization may decide that they want to abuse client information or steal a trade secret before they go to a new job or something like that. We have to be mindful. There's also shadow IT. So this is especially important as we continue to have this sort of hybrid work situation, which I think is probably the way things are going to be moving forward. More people than ever are still doing the sort of work from home thing, or maybe half the time in the office, or half the time at home, or maybe you have new people who are working outside the state. Maybe they just don't have, you've never seen them before in your life. They are completely remote workers. Or maybe they're highly dependent on personal devices. So they're using their own phone, and all of a sudden they just decide they're going to use their own personal Dropbox to share files because it's easier for them. Well, we need to avoid this kind of shadow IT so that people are doing the right things and actually and working within a system we can control. There's bad practices. So I would include things like installing software, removing tools, stopping maintenance. So we want our people to support and enable our technology tools. We don't want them getting in the way. We don't want people, getting, not enabling their multi-factor authentication because they don't want their phone involved. We don't want people saying, I don't really like this virus scanning tool, so I'm going to remove it, or I'm going to stop it from running, or just saying, I really want to install this software because I like it, and it hasn't been vetted by the IT department. We just have to avoid those kinds of risks. And there's also eavesdropping. So people need to be mindful of where they're working and how they're working. If you're working on some sensitive stuff, and let's say you're traveling, maybe it's not the best idea to work on it in the lobby of the busy hotel you're working at now that people are maybe traveling a bit more. It's stuff like that. Let's talk real quickly about stakeholders. So if we're going to develop any kind of policies or processes or practices, we need to know who's actually impacted by this stuff, because our policies will speak to risks not only internally for us, but also to the people we impact. Sometimes it's the law for you to acknowledge these stakeholders, but honestly, even if it's not a law or a regulation, I think we have an ethical responsibility to make sure that the people who are impacted by IT incidents of any kind, security or otherwise, and take their interests into account. It's just the right thing to do. The first thing we need to keep in mind are actual data subjects. So what I mean by that is actual individuals. There are many individuals that maybe we've never met or had direct engagement with in the past who are impacted, or we have data on. Maybe you're a health insurance company, and not like United Healthcare or Blue Cross or somebody that they know every person that they issue a policy for. But nevertheless, they have to create security policies and practices that support the interests of their customers that they have maybe minimal relationship with, or maybe you have a third party, or you're a third party to that company and take that information. At the end of the day, if you're carrying information on someone, there's a good chance that you are beholden to some of these privacy laws and compliance laws like HIPAA or GDPR. If you're holding information on people in the European Union, CCPA in California, there's probably going to be a federal privacy law coming in the future. PCI, if you're handling credit card information, so on and so forth. I would just say right now, if you're holding information that belongs to somebody or is important to someone, just count on it being regulated. There's obviously your clients too. So you have customers who support or who rely on you. If we're having an incident, it's important that we treat our customers or our partners or those kinds of stakeholders with respect. Staff, of course, which employees would be most impacted? If I have an incident and my main office is completely down because of ransomware, or because the building lost power, how are my employees impacted? How is it going to impact the way they work? We want them to be productive even during an incident or during or whenever something happens. So we have to identify who's most impacted by the variety of incidents and risks that we have. I mentioned this a little bit before, but business partners. So if you have, like, for example, a security incident, you may need to involve other partners who may personally not be impacted by it, but may be a part of the solution. So, you know, if you have a security incident, you're worried that maybe you'll get sued, you really should have some consideration for where your attorney lies in your policies and processes, stuff like that. And of course, the government. So whether we like it or not, any organization that is carrying sensitive data or maybe is of an industry of importance, you know, I think a lot of infrastructure companies are going to start getting more scrutiny about their security posture in light of the Colonial incident last year. The truth is that the government's going to care about how you manage security and how you manage processes and people. So keep that in mind as well. Here are a few policies to start with. So, you know, if you're new to this process, which I imagine many of you on this call probably will or probably are, the best way to, you know, how do you eat an elephant? It's you take the first bite, so to speak. The first policy I want to talk about is acceptable use. And sometimes I should say these policies, if you look for policy templates, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, the titles and what is included in these policies may vary. Sometimes people will have an all-encompassing policy that talks about anything and everything. Other times, and this is probably the way I'd usually recommend, they will chunk out these policies to specific subject matters. So anyway, acceptable use is really defining the purpose of technology and what it is and is not allowed. You know, it's not really reasonable to expect our staff to do the right things when we haven't explained to them what the right things are. And that's where acceptable use comes in. And these rules need to be reasonable and make sense and logical. Any of the policies I talk about, if we want people to buy into them and follow them and do these things, I think we owe it to them as managers to say, hey, this is the policy, and not only this is what we're doing, but this is why it exists. You know, people are much more willing to buy into inconveniences or challenges or different processes that maybe they're not familiar with if they understand why they matter. So when you draft maybe an acceptable use policy and you tell people, hey, here are the conditions in which you do personal browsing at work. Here are the conditions in which you download or share data with a third party. Here's the way you're allowed to file an expense, or here's the way whatever. When you put all that stuff out there and you make it clear what is and is not acceptable and why, I think you're just going to have a much better outcome because people should be on the same page. Also, when it comes to the culture thing, and I'm going to talk a lot about this in our next month's webinar, when we get everybody buying into these policies early on, it means when new people come in, the policy is already a part of the culture. And even if somebody is maybe a little confused by the policy or not familiar with the policy or concerned about it, you usually have this support system around them of other people on your team creating a culture of security and process. Another policy to talk about is sensitive data. So a sensitive data policy, and you might call it, again, you might call any of these something else. It characterizes specific types of data that you hold as sensitive and how it should be treated. Now, a lot of people by default think of some of the PII stuff I mentioned before. So electronic medical records, credit card numbers, social security numbers, addresses, names, phone numbers, whatever. But that's not necessarily the only items that are sensitive, you know. Here at DP Solutions, for example, we carry, information on our clients' networks. You know, we're an IT services company. And so as naturally, some of our sensitive data is technical in nature. Maybe some of the sensitive data you have is accounting information. Maybe it's trade secrets. You know, this is the secret sauce, you know, to the Coca-Cola Corporation, the recipe for Coke, which my understanding is still I think it's still in like a safe or something somewhere. Maybe that's an urban legend. But the idea is that this kind of information is so important to them that they're considering it sensitive and they give it special procedures. You need to think about that for yourself too. What actually matters? The other thing I'll say about this is that when you define the sensitive data, part of your policy should address where that data goes and how it should be organized differently. We want to have sensitive data buckets, if you were. So the information on, for example, like if I wrote a draft blog for our website, which I do all the time, that information doesn't belong in the same place as, say, our payroll information. It just doesn't make sense. The blog I write about, IT policies or something like that, do I want it out there? Do I want it to be stolen? Probably not. But it's not the same in terms of weight as data like our payroll information. So you're keeping this in mind not only to define it in policy and how people handle it, but also when you're developing these technical solutions and you're building your technology around these processes, we want the technology to support what's already been defined by the organization. I hope that makes sense. There's also disaster and incident response. So this might define, and again, there's some people might call it security and response. Some people might call it disaster recovery. The terminology isn't the most important thing, but it does outline what an incident is, different types of incidents, the organizational response, the team members, both internally and externally, etc. You might talk about your cyber insurance company. You might talk about the lawyers that you work with. You might talk about the people on your team and their backups who might jump in if something is needed, stuff like that. So it's a very broad thing, and it should change over time. One thing that I should mention is there is no perfect policy. These are living documents. We should be going back and evaluating them. More on that in a bit. There's also the security management policy. So this is important in particular for compliance and auditing purposes, but also just in general. We want to define the security posture of the organization, how security is assessed, and metrics for security success. So it's sort of like a mission statement in a way. So we're saying, hey, as an organization, this is what we think about security. These are the risks that we know are out there. As such, here are the solutions we put in place and the rules we put in place to support that. If an auditor ever came in or a compliance guy ever came in and they said, okay, what is your security posture and why are you doing things this way? You may have something that's a little bit abnormal. Maybe you're using a product that's very specialized and requires different kinds of security than something traditional. The benefit of having a good security management policy and something documented is that it speaks to the logic of everything. And no one can ever accuse you, if you have a logical thing that you're going back to over and over and over again and maintaining, of burying your head in the sand. Security incidents, disasters, et cetera, those things can happen. And they happen more often to organizations that don't prepare for them, but they can happen to organizations that do. And so this is kind of a sort of a CYA, so to speak, when it comes to making sure that you outline that this is an important thing to your organization. So I'd highly recommend it. A few of the more advanced policies, and I put it advanced in quotes because I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist or a genius or a lawyer necessarily to start putting this stuff together. But maybe these come after you get the core policies in place, if that makes sense. So a few things, we bring up remote access policy. Maybe this is not something you're doing now. Maybe everyone's back in the office, but I think there's a lot of things to be said for telling people what's expected of them when they work from home. And it doesn't have to be draconic or negative or nasty. It's just basic things. Like, for example, if you bring your work laptop home with you, don't allow your family members to play with it. If you are bringing on a new personal device, you just replaced your iPhone, you got the latest iPhone, you have to report this to the IT department or your MSP or whatever so that they can onboard it right. If you're having issues accessing stuff, this is the way you do it. You get the idea. Anything having to do with what's expected of people when they're working remotely. There are also policies regarding data retention. So, you might be in an industry or an organization where there's a question about how long you actually have to keep information. The one problem with data is that you tend to have this like snowball, and it's like an avalanche kind of where people want to capture everything. We want to keep these client lists and these lead lists, and we want to keep our old client information and the documentation we have on this and this and this and this. But the truth is that 10 years later, a lot of that information is completely irrelevant. You'll never hear about it again, and it's not that important. Some industries will have rules and say, for example, I believe in law, it's something like, or with Glass-Steagall, I think it's like 7 years that you have to retain certain pieces of information. All that should be documented. this is our opinion based on the sensitivity of the data, the type of data it is, so on and so forth, that this is how long we retain this data before destroying it. And this is, by the way, how we destroy it. When we're retiring a physical server, we hire X and Y company that goes in and they shred the hard drives and provides us documentation, things like that. Another policy I'll bring up is the idea of bring your own device and mobile device policies. So very important. I think if I was to guess, most organizations are not issuing iPhones or Android phones to people. They're usually using people's own devices, maybe putting some security on, which I'd really recommend. A lot of the mobile device tools are both non-intrusive and in terms of the person's privacy, but also very strong on security. But we should establish what the expectations are with these personal devices. There's obviously weird mixing that's happening right now between company data and personal information, both on these cell phones. And while that may make people a little nervous, I would say that if managed properly, it doesn't have to be a big deal or a problem. As I mentioned here, you can see in the note, all these principles can be combined. It can be named differently. You might need more or less. At the end of the day, all the policies we talk about should be sort of centered around the goals of the organization and not certain policy names. I don't think we necessarily have to be looking at a checklist of policies to check off. We should think about who we are, what matters to us, what our risks are, what our challenges are, and all of our policies should speak to the organization's goals. I think a lot of times, and this could go to anything when it comes to technology, people try to implement the technology first or create the thing first, and they focus on their mission second, but everything should start with the mission first, and everything should come behind that. I hope that principle makes sense. Communication, acknowledgement, and culture. So, policy, I literally just said this, policy shouldn't be an item that's checked off. It needs to be taken to heart. So here's how you get the most out of it. So staff really must understand policy importance and understand what's expected before we give them access. So, some of the things we do at DP Solutions, just to give you an idea, we recently changed some of our deployment policies, things like that. And I issued I used some of our tools to get everyone to read and acknowledge the policy, make sure they check it off, get written acknowledgments, et cetera. And then I also explain, what the consequences are if they don't follow the policy. So they know it means something and they know they have to take it to heart. Anybody can just sign a policy and turn it in. But people should really understand that it matters. And the only way it matters is to have a little bit more direct engagement and emotional weight behind it, if that makes sense. If you just throw it in front of somebody and say, sign this, they'll sign whatever you throw in front of them. It doesn't mean they're going to follow it. People comply more with policy when they understand why it exists. I alluded to this earlier. The best example I could give, and this isn't so much a policy thing, but it has to do with multi-factor authentication. I hear so much stuff from people where they implement a multi-factor authentication solution, and then staff members don't like that they get a text on their phone, and it's my phone, or I don't want this, or I don't want that. But I think a lot of the times when that happens, no one's really addressed the people side of this. No one's gone to the individual and say, hey, listen, it's a text to your phone. We're not getting any information off your phone. We're not stealing anything from you or looking at your pictures or anything like that. There's oftentimes misconceptions about those sorts of things. There's also the problem where we throw inconveniences and challenges at people, and then we don't give them rationale for why we're doing it. And we say, okay, guess what? Now you have to use this email system that's maybe a few more steps to send an encrypted email. And now you have to do this authentication thing that requires an extra step. And now if you want to file this piece of information away, you have to file it in this specific system. And some employee says, well, this is annoying. It's this, I spend an extra 20 minutes a day dealing with this stuff. And yeah, I mean, it stinks. I don't want to minimize the fact that some of these things are annoying, but what really stinks is when we have a security incident. And this is how this solution, MFA, helps us address the risks that the organization has that someone could break into an account and start committing fraud and maybe impact your payroll information, impact your personal information. And that's why we're doing this stuff. Having that kind of candid conversation with people about why things are in place, whether it's a tool or policy or anything else, I think is so critically important. Policy should be subject to change, but it must always be followed. So look, I mean, I think we should have an open discussion with people when they think a policy doesn't make sense. Well, I know we're trying to do this security thing, but here's how it impacts me, and it's not really working, whatever. Well, a discussion is fine. You know, we should look for insights from people as to how to make policy better. But the answer to a policy that needs to be improved is not disregarding the policy. So again, this kind of gets the culture, management, stuff like that. A policy review should happen regularly, but also when major changes happen. So, you know, I think it makes a lot of sense, at least on an annual basis, to go back through your policies. And, you know, one way to look at it is it's like kind of a wave, is that you look maybe through one policy per month or something like that. Maybe if you have 12 policies, you get that kind of that thing. But when you make a major change, like maybe you double in size, or you make a complete overhaul of your technology, or your mission changes, or you have a merger, or, you know, big business changes happen, I think oftentimes that's a great opportunity to look at policy and ask, are we still the same organization than we were before? You know, I was talking about remote access. I mean, if your remote access policy is the same as it was in 2018 or 2019, that's probably an issue, because since COVID happened, the whole world changed. And there's a good chance that your policy doesn't speak to the same risks that it did 3 or 4 years ago. Those who intentionally violate policy should face consequences. So I say intentionally. No one's perfect. You know, I don't think we should ding up people when they have a small lapse in judgment or make a mistake that they're legitimately remorseful of and not intending to screw up. But if someone's just like, you know what, I'm going to use this Dropbox thing, and I don't care if they say use SharePoint, I'm just going to do it, and they're not going to do anything about it, that's when we have to step up and say our policies matter. So look, I'm not going to tell anybody exactly how they need to manage their people, but there has to be some weight behind this, because the consequences are bigger than the individual. Policy exceptions should be minimal and documented. So, you know, I'm not going to say that we should look for reasons to not do what's in our policy, but there may be some extenuating circumstances. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we had a huge disaster and our building was completely on fire and nobody had access to anything that they had before, and we have to give information to somebody else, and the only way I can do it is to send the email from my new phone. You know, I can see why that might require a policy exception. But I think what would be good is if we actually say, okay, we made this exception one time, here's why we made it, and we're documenting it in case something bad happens from it. Again, this kind of gets to the security management policy as well, where we're sort of going through and we're saying, you know, policy matters. This is something we care about. We're showing our due diligence, and things aren't perfect, but we're explaining why they're not perfect. You want everybody on the same page. Not everyone has to love them or agree with them, but they must follow them. You know, we have to be bottom line about this, which is that there has to be rules that apply to everybody when it comes to this stuff. It only really takes one individual to violate the policies to create a serious incident. A few resources. I know a lot of you are probably maybe intimidated or looking to start. A few areas. So first is the SANS Institute. I think it's sansinstitute.org, but you can Google it. They're great. They have a whole page full of various policy templates that you can cut and paste, put in, and they're going to be bare bones. I mean, they're just going to have the structure of the policy, but at least it gives you sort of a guideline, a blueprint, if you will, of what you need to put into it. And they're very useful, and they'll also address the sort of 3 policies are named different things, but sort of say the same thing. So that'll be out there too. Another thing I've used in the past is academic institutions. So if I wasn't sure how I wanted to, what the language I wanted to use for something was, or how should I address this specific thing, one thing that's kind of cool is that a lot of colleges and universities will publicize some of their things. Sometimes they'll do it for educational reasons, like this is how you create these publications. But you can literally pull policies if you feel like the way they approach something suits you. And it's not just academic institutions. Some companies do this as well. You know, I don't think you need to be the most creative when it comes to policy, as long as it speaks to you. So feel free to lift some stuff from these publicly available resources. There's also your peers. I mean, I think if you're working in an industry, let's say, you know, healthcare, finance, law, whatever, and you're creating your policies for the first time, I mean, there's other office managers out there who have had to do this before. Most people are willing to give you insight. I know for me, as an MSP, I have peers of MSPs from around the country that whenever I'm not sure how to do something, I reach out to them and we get some great information operationally, not just policy, but processes and stuff like that. So never underestimate the power of your peers. There's also attorneys, consultants, and people like me. So, you know, look, if your policies are getting really serious and you're concerned about whether they'll be acceptable in a court of law, that's when you need to get real lawyers and stuff who have experience with specific policy management. There are also consultants out there who maybe that's all they do is help write policy. They'll spend some time in your organization, understand your operation a little bit better, and speak to policies. You know, and again, it's beyond just implementing technology, but just how people use stuff, how you operate your workflows, et cetera. And then also, you know, I'm happy to give you some insights as well. I don't have time really to put together people's policies anymore or do that sort of stuff, but I can give you my insights and hopefully give you a few tips to help move you along your way. The last line I wrote here, let your vendors and partners help support you, but own the policy yourself. That's extremely important. So at the end of the day, you can't outsource management. You can't make it so that somebody else handles the tough work for you of dealing with people. They can help you draft the policy. They can help you put something together. But you're the one who's the closest to your people. And you're the one who knows what their tics are, what they care about, what they don't care about, what your organization's needs are. As I could spend, unless I spent 40 hours a week with you in your office, I don't think I'm going to have that cultural and workflow intimacy that's necessary to create a perfect policy. You have to own it. Let your vendors support you. I always say, like anything with security, it's like climbing Mount Everest, but you need a Sherpa to help you get up Mount Everest, but the Sherpa is not going to drag you up Mount Everest, if that makes sense. So anyway, that's it for the content we prepared in advance. I'm happy to answer questions in the chat, but while you guys put those questions in and we wait on it, I will talk about our webinar next month. So speaking to a lot of things, sort of complements what we're talking about today is onboarding new employees. So how to create a culture of cybersecurity when bringing on new staff. That's going to be the last Wednesday in April, as usual, at 11 a.m. You can register at dpsolutions.com/events. I would love to chat with all of you and provide insights in that regard. I'm already working on the content right now. I was working on it yesterday. And yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, I don't underestimate at all the people aspect of this. Not all of us are going to have the budgets or the technology to buy all of these crazy cybersecurity solutions that are very good and very powerful, but don't suit every organization. And unless we address the people side, we could be putting ourselves in a bad place. You can feel free to reach out to me as well, the contact information on the right. So with that all out of the way, Jill, what questions do we have?
Yep, just as a reminder, any questions, just type them out into the question box and we'll answer them. All right, our first question is how often should I review or refresh my policies?
Yeah, I mean, at a minimum once a year. And the refresh could be as little as changing a few lines in it. You know, one paragraph doesn't sound right or something like that. Or it could be that you have no changes at all. Maybe things haven't changed that much for you. I don't know. But there's a good, I mean, look, there's a good chance, you know, things change so rapidly in life. It just feels like if you gave it a year, the things I was talking about, acceptable use, sensitive data, security posture, remote access. I mean, I would imagine that for anybody on this call, that something changed in the past year. And so if you haven't looked at your policies and see how they need to be adjusted, you know, I think you're due for it. And then, as I mentioned before, if you're making a big change in general, like we're moving, we're changing our office, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're switching our technology out, we're organizationally reshifting, you know, whatever. Definitely a good time to look at process and policy, because then you can almost be assured that what you had before is not no longer accurate.
Okay, great. Let's see, another question came in. Can my policies be used to comply with security regulations and standards?
Absolutely. In fact, you'll probably be required to have policies and processes in place for a compliance standard. if you go and you grab NIST 800-171, which is a IT security framework, or you go look at HIPAA or PCI rules, or the CMMC stuff that's popping off for the defense contractors, or any of the other things, you're going to find that a chunk of the standards, and it could be 200 of them, are going to be about things that have nothing to do with bits and bytes. They're going to be having to do with things like criminal background checks, or acceptable use policies, or defining what sensitive data is, or data classification, or any of these number of other things that will require policies. And you're not going to pass. You could have the most amazing security monitoring solution, data loss prevention tools, application control, all those amazing things. But if you don't have the policies, you're not going to be considered compliant, and you could be running afoul of regulation.
All right, thanks, Ben. Let's see. Should I allow my employees to use their personal devices to access company data?
Yeah, and the answer is yes, but. So the answer is yes, you should certainly. The reality is that I brought it up before, is that especially in the case of cell phones and tablets, you just see a lot of personal use of these devices. It's kind of a cultural thing. I kind of feel like when iPhones started coming around in the first place, in the 2007 was the first iPhone. It feels like it was more like, let's get the devices connected first and get these functions, and then let's secure them later, or let's create policy about it later. It's not so much that it can't be done. I mean, I definitely think they can. It's just that you have to have rules around it. So the more we give people when it comes to their personal devices, the more security we have to put on it. And with mobile devices, that's not such a big deal because the tools are really accustomed to do that. But if it was somebody's personal laptop, it might be a little bit different. You might have to restrict some of the things they can do on that device, especially if they value their personal privacy. Maybe they have sensitive personal photos or something on it. Maybe that device shouldn't be the device you use for your work stuff, because we're going to have to do security things on it that make that device less private for you. There has to be a give and take. But the good news is that in most cases, most use cases, especially with the mobile devices, which is where this really applies most, you don't have to compromise all that much.
Okay, that's great. I see one more question come in. Are there any types of information that are more of a concern to keep private than others?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, and it's really going to depend on the organization. And I'll come at this from a few perspectives. The first is obviously any information that is legally protected or regulated, or et cetera, that has to take top priority, because now you're talking about lawsuits, and you're talking about fines and scrutiny from the government or trade organizations and stuff like that. And you have to take those very, very seriously. But one thing I tell people is that other types of information, maybe the non-regulated information, it's sort of like what's one person's trash is another person's treasure, so to speak. Some people might think that marketing materials, and I use marketing materials as an example because it's very public facing, but they might think that prepping marketing materials is important, and we should secure it, but not critical. As I said, if the draft of this slide deck got out there in advance, I might not be happy about it, but I also wouldn't be calling the FBI about it, because it's not that big of a deal. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that I was the Sony, right? And I'm about to release the PlayStation 6 or something like that. And I have this great slide deck and these images that I want to put out there. And then that information gets out there. Nobody's going to sue Sony because their trade secrets got out there, their prototype information got out there. No one's suing them because of that. But that's tremendously damaging to them. So you really have to ask yourself that in terms of what's more sensitive than the other, it's a very personal question. This is where dialogue matters, working with your partners matter, and sort of the emotional energy that's spent up front thinking about how you're impacted, who are the actual stakeholders of your information,
Mhm.
what matters to you and where.
Right. Okay, we actually did get another question in going back to the personal devices. So I'm going to read that. So what about installing company licenses on personal devices? The cost involved with added security will add up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, this is sort of it gets back to the give and take. So some tools, you know, security tools, I think the cost is so minor that maybe you shouldn't worry about it too much. You know, if keeping an employee happy costs you $1 or $2 a month in security tools to use a specific device, you know, I feel like it adds up, but I also think that it's maybe not worth the fight, if that makes sense. But the reality is that once you give somebody access to sensitive information on a device, there has to be agreement to security, or that device cannot access the data. Or you could just decide, you know, I guess I suppose a third option could be a third rail, if you really want to go that direction, would be, you know what, we're just not going to care. And we're going to let our employees do whatever they want. And we're going to let them use their personal devices and not force them to use MFA and not force them to have, you know, endpoint detection. And we're not going to force them because they don't like it. And we don't want to upset this person. Well, fine. You've put the interests of that one individual above the interests of the privacy and security of the organization. And so there has to be a give and take. There has to. And there is a happy medium here. And maybe some people aren't going to be happy with what you end up on. But at the end of the day, no one's going to be happy if you're facing a ransomware incident, everybody loses their jobs, the organization gets fined or sued or whatever. No one's going to be happy. We can't allow minor concerns to overshadow the big picture problem, which is that cybersecurity and technology incidents could be catastrophic to the organization. I can't say that enough. So if the person who's asking the question wants to talk about some specifics for them, I'm happy to talk about it offline because I know these things can be sensitive in nature.
Yeah, okay, great. And again, we will be emailing out Ben's contact information after this.
Absolutely.
Okay, oh yeah, another question came in.
Wow, tons of questions.
Would it be more cost effective to issue company cells or laptops allowing the monitoring of these concerns?
Maybe, you know, again, it's probably you have to get your paperwork out and you have to tally it up. Who gets the devices? How many devices do we need? How much are the tools costing? What are the tools needed? Honestly, most of the time, it's fine to let people use their own mobile devices. It depends on how sensitive it is, how much security is really sensitive people who are traveling a lot and they're dealing with sensitive information. And I could see why you might say, we're going to issue them personal phones that are for business only, that have a bunch of security tools because the expense can be justified. But stuff like Intune for mobile device management, which is a Microsoft product, I believe. Oh, it looks like we have an audio thing. I have to wrap it up. But those sorts of tools are generally, we're talking about the single digits in dollars per month. When we're talking about things like giving people their own personal business email address, we're talking a few dollars a month. When we're talking about things like endpoint detection, it's a few dollars a month. Or device encryption, it's a couple dollars or whatever it is. You know, these are not big expenses. And I know a cell phone, I mean, a cell phone bill's got to be $100 if you want, you know, texting and unlimited calling and data and all that other stuff. And plus the cost of the device itself, which is not insignificant. You know, an iPhone is something like $1,000 without the subsidies. So there's that too. Before I wrap it up, Jill, you can type it in chat. Is there any other questions? I will address them if anybody has any other questions.
Nope, no more questions.
No more questions. Okay, I can sort of hear Jill. Well, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. There will be a recording available if you want to see it. If you want to talk to me, just feel free to reach out via the email. Please attend our next webinar. We really appreciate all of this. I hope it was helpful, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.